Hello and welcome. Today, I just want to share a short video with you um, about some hip movements and specifically hip joint movements. So I'm going to just introduce my little skeleton, Charlie. Charlie's going to help us demonstrate. So, and when we're talking about the hip joint, we are specifically talking about this ball and socket joint where the femur bone sits in the hip socket. And when we're talking about hip movements, in this particular case, what we're going to be talking about is this ball and socket joint, this femur bone moving in this hip socket. So the movements that we're going to do today are movements to get you really connected to this relationship, the femur bone moving in the hip socket, and to kind of clear up the pathways in the brain and clear up, clean up this movement. Because often what happens when there's issues with this movement, whether that's because of some stickiness or pathways in the brain just not working great, what can happen is that this movement can get a little stuck, a little sticky, and then a lot of other parts have to start compensating for the lack of that movement. And so what ends up happening is instead of this ball and socket joint moving like it should, like to do this kind of movement, or say in walking to do this kind of movement, sometimes that moves further up. And so we end up with the low back getting involved, or maybe this relationship isn't working very well. So the knees start to have to take more of the impact. So a lot of times when we can clean up this relationship and we can get this ball and socket joint working really well, we can resolve issues in other places. We can resolve issues in the low back, maybe knee strain. So we get this relationship working really well and start getting connected to kind of the muscles surrounding that ball and socket joint, the glutes, some of those outer hip muscles, inner hip muscles, and the muscles in the front of the hip. And it's not important what the names of them are right now. But when we can get connected to the movement of the hip bone or the leg bone in the hip socket and getting the muscles online and working well surrounding that joint, we can start getting stronger, more stable, more connected, because the pelvis is really the foundation of our movement. And so it can also clean up a lot of the compensations in our body, a lot of the problems that arise when that is not functioning really well. So I'm going to show you just three simple movements that can help to improve that relationship, and then give you some options for how we can take those movements into different positions, different orientations of the body. So just one other thing to demonstrate here with the skeleton before we put that one up. The movements that we're going to be doing are moving in the three planes. So we have the sagittal plane, which means that we're moving in this direction. So the movement of the leg bone in the hip socket is moving kind of forward and up, that's flexion, or back, and that's extension. Yeah. So this is sagittal plane movement in this direction. The frontal plane movement. So the great thing about the ball and socket joint is it can move in all three planes. That's moving the leg bone out and in, out and in. And that is, again, frontal plane, and that's abduction away from the body and adduction toward the body. And then the last movement, we'll zoom this in a little bit more. The last movement is rotation of the leg bone in the hip socket. So that's internal rotation and external rotation. So I'm exaggerating that. Our leg bones are not going to pop out of the socket, but we can see that it's a rotation. So the whole leg bone is rotating inward for internal rotation. Whole leg bone is rotating outward for external rotation, in and out. So those are the three movements that we're going to get curious about. And the other thing to note is that when that leg bone is the one that's moving, that leg bone is moving in the hip socket, Note that the pelvis, this is our pelvic structure, right? That pelvis doesn't need to move because the leg bone is doing the work. The leg bone is the one that's moving in the hip socket in those three ranges. The pelvis can stay really stable and still. So we're going to get clear on that relationship. The first movement is just to come to your back. And for these movements, we will need a block and a strap. We're not going to need them right at first, but have those handy. So I'm just going to demonstrate this first one. Super easy one. We're coming onto our backs. We're going to get comfortable in our back. And then think about that movement that I just showed you of the leg bones moving out and in, out and in. So that's what we're doing with the leg bones in the hip socket. So we're just moving the leg bones out and back in, out and back in. So the things that we want to do here are keep that pelvis nice and stable. So if that relationship isn't very clear or isn't functioning super well, the leg bone moving in the hip socket, you might notice your pelvis kind of wants to wobble or be unstable. So I'm just showing you what can happen, a little exaggeration to show that. Another thing that can happen here is that the hip flexor that lives right in the front of the hip, often it will want to contract to try to make this movement happen. And that's not really the hip flexor's job. So we want those hip flexors, and you can find those by feeling into the creases in the front of your hips and either contracting the muscle there, or if that's a little challenging to find, you can just lift a foot and you should feel that hip flexor. You should feel it firing. You should feel it kind of pressing into your hand as you lift your foot. So once you have found where those hip flexors are, then you can keep your hands there and start to move the legs wide and back together. And notice if you feel those hip flexors firing. So if you do feel them firing, then we're just going to move in a smaller range. So you can move in a way that doesn't make those hip flexors fire. And you want the movement to be really smooth. And it's fine for it to be really small because this is about clearing up and cleaning up that movement and that relationship between the leg bone and the pelvis. So it doesn't need to be big. Bigger isn't better. Okay. And you can just do that a few times and really get clear on what you're feeling. Feel into that hip joint and see if you can actually feel that big leg bone moving in the hip socket. The clearer we can get that relationship established in our brains, the better for our functional movement. Okay. And then to go a little bit deeper dive with this, we're going to use our block and our strap so that we can kind of start to feel the muscles surrounding those leg bones maybe start to engage or contract to make this movement. So here we're just kind of using gravity, right? So then we're going to add a little resistance so we can start to feel the muscles engaging. So we'll start with the block between the knees. We're just going to place it between the knees kind of this way between those femur bones. And you can play around if it on the flatter setting, if that's too narrow, you can always do it on the wider setting instead. So we're going to bring that between the knees, and then we're just going to squeeze into the block. So again, we're still moving the femur bones in, but we're squeezing into the block. And here you might start to feel those adductor muscles, the inner thigh muscles next to the groin and running down the insides of the thighs or that femur bone. You might feel those contracting or squeezing to pull the leg bones in toward the block. You can do a few rounds of that and see if you can really feel that movement. And then what you want to be quiet here are these outer hip muscles
And then those hip flexors again, right? Those will be more quiet, the outer hip muscles. Yeah, and down the legs. All of this should be quiet. So if this is making that happen, if this is feeling like it's pushing or the quads are starting to really fire up and engage, just see what you can do to let those get softer and quieter and see if you can just use those inner thigh muscles. And again, maybe that means that the movement gets a little bit smaller. It's not about how big you can make it or how strong your inner thighs are. It's just about cleaning up the relationship, right? Just getting us using the muscles that we need to use to make the movement happen. Okay. And then when you've done that a few times and you've gotten kind of clearer maybe on that relationship, we'll take our strap. So I just set the block aside. You could leave the block there if you wanted to. I'm just gonna set it aside and we'll take the strap and I have it fastened so that so that it won't so that it'll stay fastened around my thighs as I'm pressing into that strap. And this time we're taking the legs out, we're taking the legs open, yeah, and we're seeing what we feel there. We're pressing into the strap and we're seeing what we feel here. And here we'd love to feel some outer hip engagement, maybe some glutes. Yeah, and still the fronts, those hip flexors, we still want those to be relatively quiet. And then on this one, we particularly want those inner thigh muscles to stay nice and relaxed because they're the ones that need to release as these outer thighs get active and engaged. We're pressing into that strap and we're just going to feel that. So we're pressing and releasing, we're not just holding, but we're pressing and releasing. And again, it really doesn't matter how big you make this movement or how small. The much more important thing is that you get really clear on the relationship and that you reduce compensation. So things that we're looking for here is, can we breathe well? Can the pelvis stay nice and stable and still? Can the jaw soften? Can our shoulders stay relaxed? Are we tensing anywhere further up the chain to try to squeeze and make this happen, right? Is the low back lifting, anything like that? Because those are all compensations. Those are things that we don't need to be happening just to move the leg bone in the hip socket. So do that 10 times or so, 10, 15 times, whatever feels good. If you're really, really struggling with this, if that relationship is very unclear, and you need to make really small, really slow movements, I recommend doing a lot less of them, actually doing 3 or 4. Get really clear on that relationship before you start doing more of the movement. Because if you're doing this in a compensated way and you just keep doing it in that compensated way and you're just doing more and more of them, then you're not clearing up that relationship at all. And that's just going to kind of reinforce those compensated movement patterns. Okay. So that's the abduction and adduction for the flexion and extension. So we already have our legs in extension here. So you can even kind of move your legs a little bit further away from your hips, move them a little closer to your hips. Notice, sorry, you have your legs in flexion here, not extension. So notice that flexion is already here because the legs are bent. So we've already moved into the bent position for the leg bones. So from here, then we're going to try to move the leg bones into extension by lifting the hips straight up. So to do this, we're going to want the the pelvis to stay relatively stable and still. So think about that pelvis from the skeleton that we looked at earlier. That's going to stay stable and still, and it's going to lift straight up as the leg bones move forward to take the leg bones into extension. So what that might look like is that we're pressing a little bit into the feet, lifting the hips up, straight up, and then coming straight back down. So notice how my legs move into more of that extended, yeah, leg bones moving in the hip sockets. So this time the pelvis is moving too, but it's moving as one unit and just lifting straight up. Lifting straight up. And the glutes, we want to feel the glutes engage here. So we don't want to squeeze the glutes and then lift, right? Notice what happened to my pelvis as soon as I squeeze the glutes, right? And my pelvis lifts back, tilts back, and then I'm kind of pushing up, and then I have to really engage my quads and my low back here. And that's that is a movement. There's nothing wrong with that movement necessarily, but it's not the one that we're trying to reinforce in our bodies here. It's not the pathway that we're trying to get established. The one we're trying to get established is pelvis lifting straight up, leg bones moving into extension. The glutes come online because they have to lift the pelvis up, and then it releases to lower down. So again, taking just a few rounds of that, try to get really clear. And to be honest, this is a really, really hard movement. And sometimes stabilizing the leg bones can be helpful. So we can bring a block between the knees and do the movement with the block between the knees. We could do the strap around the thighs. We could even do the block and the strap together to get really stable here. I'll just demonstrate that. Looks something like that. And then lifting, hips lift up. Notice how my knees have to move away from my body to bring those leg bones into extension. Yeah. And if this movement is an inch, that's great. If you can feel the glutes engage, the hips lift up, you're doing great. And honestly, if you're struggling with this one, do it in front of a mirror. Turn on your Zoom and do it in front of your camera, whatever you need to do to help you find this movement, because this is a tough one. So have fun playing with that. The last one that we're doing is that rotation movement, the internal and external rotation. So I'm just gonna scooch myself over here where I can get my legs up the wall. Actually, it's the legs up my fridge. We're gonna bring legs up the fridge. So we want the hips totally flat on the mat. We want that whole pelvis to be on the mat. We want a good distance between our hips and the wall. So we don't want our hips scooched right up next to the wall. And then we're going to bring the legs up and we're going to keep kind of a softness in the knees. So here, then we're going to start to rotate the leg bone in the hip socket. So I'm going to demonstrate with my hands so you can see that it's the big leg bone moving in this hip socket. We're rotating it externally, and then we're rotating it internally. The pelvis is going to stay still, and the movement comes from the leg bone moving in the hip socket. And here, you'll probably feel those outer hip muscles and the lower glutes in the back engaging to make this happen. And then those a little bit in the upper area of the hip here when we're doing the internal rotation. And then the lower and the outer with the external rotation. And it's okay if you can't feel exactly specifically. If you can feel the leg bone moving in the hip socket and that pelvis is staying quiet, you can count on that your body knows what it's doing and it's using what it needs to use to make that movement happen. And then just keep feeling into that. Keep seeing if you can get clearer and clearer on what muscles are engaging, what's happening in that hip, in that in those big hip muscles and in that joint. And then switch sides. Do both sides and try to do about the same number on each side. We don't really need to count anything here. You should feel when you're tired of doing it. Your hip is going to get a little fatigued, probably. And then
you know to stop. And again, you also want to not do so many that that relationship starts to get really fuzzy, or um, you can't feel the leg bone moving in the hip socket. Another thing to watch for here is leading with the knees or the feet. So sometimes we want to make this movement happen with the knee, or we want to make it happen with the foot because we're kind of used to doing the foot or the knee to make this happen. The feet and the knees are going to move, but they're not moving because they're leading the movement. They're moving because they're just kind of going along for the ride. They have to in order to make the movement happen. But the movement is coming from the big leg bones rotating in the hip socket. Whew, and that's tiring. So let's stop there. I want to show you, I want to just give you a couple of options for how you can do those movements in maybe a different orientation. So depending on yourself, depending on if you're recommending these movements to a friend, it may be that being on the floor is not available. So you can do these movements in seated, you can do them in standing. And sometimes it's nice to play in seated or in standing, just just to give you a different way of doing them. And then also changing the load, right? So once we've gotten really connected to those movements on our back, then coming into seating or coming into standing gives us a different orientation, but it also gives us a different load. So we start to gain a little bit a little bit more strength, a little bit more stability as we do those in seated or standing. So today I'm just going to give you a couple of how you would do those in standing so you can see what that might look like. So let me just adjust my camera a little bit so we can see. Yeah. So it might cut off my head, but that's all right. So to do these in standing, we can do the same thing that we were doing with the block and the strap, but we can just do them in standing. Or what I really like to do is to do them with my hips against a wall. So I'm choosing my fridge here and coming into kind of a little wall sit. So not super far down. We want to be able to kind of maintain this and be really comfortable and easy. So my back is against the wall. And then we'll just take the block between the knees, just like we did before. And same thing here. You're just squeezing. Yeah. And all the same stuff applies as before. Squeezing to find those inner thigh muscles and to get that leg bone moving in the hip socket. And with the hips against the wall, we can feel whether the pelvis is staying stable or not. It gives us a little extra input. Okay. And then the same thing with the strap. Take the strap around the legs. And you want that to be about hip distance. I didn't say that before, but we want that to be kind of hip distance. And then we're just pressing into the strap in this orientation. So same thing, slightly different orientation. A little bit more load, so it's a little bit more challenging, a little bit harder in standing. And all the same stuff applies. We still want the hip flexors to be quiet. We still want the outer hip muscles, the low glutes, the glute muscles to be the ones making this happen, not the inner thigh muscles. Yeah. Okay. And then the other one that I wanted to show is the rotation. Actually, I'll do both. So we'll do the extension and then we'll also do rotation. So the way you can do the rotation, two ways you can do it. One is just to find something to hold on to. Because we're not really trying to challenge the balance too much here, but we are going to be balancing. So get really stable, find something to hold on to, shift your weight to one leg, and then just come onto the ball of the opposite foot, and then just take the leg bone in and out and find your rotation. Yeah. So another way to do that is by standing on a block. so that we can have the leg straight instead of having the knee bent like we did there. So we can stand on a block, let the leg just hang, and then same thing, internal and external rotation. And the same thing here, we want that pelvis to stay nice and quiet. Yeah. You can do both sides. So, you can try it with foot on the mat, knee rotating in and out, or standing on the block. And notice that my pelvis stays still. It's just the leg bone moving in the hip socket. And for me, I can really feel those lower glutes engaging here on both sides, both the standing leg and the rotating leg. Okay. And then to move the leg bone in that sagittal plane, the flexion and extension, it's also nice to stand on a block. You can also do this just on steps. If you have a step, you can just have like one foot on the step and one foot off the step. And then move the leg bone into flexion, forward, and then into extension, back, forward and back. And this is like we were doing the bridge lifts. And the thing here is to notice if your pelvis can stay still here, or if we're moving into kind of this big, if we're getting the low back involved and doing this kind of thing, right? Because it's not the low back that we want to be doing the job here. It's the leg bone moving in the hip socket. And it's going to be really small range in that extension. The flexion has a lot bigger range. Extension is really small. You can have, I have my foot in a bit of a dorsal flexion here, but you can just have it relaxed too. It doesn't need to be flexed. Okay, hands do both sides. On this side, flexion, trying to keep the pelvis nice and still, and the extension. So these are harder. These are much, much, much harder. I would recommend kind of only playing with these maybe once you've done the others in the reclined and you have a pretty good grasp on that relationship of the leg bone moving in the hip socket before you come to standing and play. You're welcome to come to standing and play anytime, of course, but just thinking about, because you're having a balance here, because you've got gravity kind of pressing down on you, you're standing on one leg, and the pelvis is much less stable. So when we're lying flat, the pelvis is kind of supported and stable, but here the pelvis can kind of wobble and rotate all over the place. So you want to try to be pretty clear on that relationship of the leg bone moving in the hip socket before you come into these. And then lots of different ways you can think about keeping the pelvis still here. Hands on the hips can be a good one. Watching yourself in the mirror to see what's happening. Noticing what you feel. That's a big one, is noticing what you feel. Noticing if you feel the low back engaging, or the moving into a back bend, or the ribs coming forward. All of those are things that are indicating that pelvis is moving in a tipping kind of way, with the pelvis moving instead of the leg bone being the thing that's moving. Okay. All right. So have fun playing, and let me know if you have any questions. If you're curious, you want to explore more, you want to do some private sessions with me, just reach out to me. I'm happy to help you work on the relationship with your hips, your shoulders, or anything else that you're wanting to work on improving your functional movement. So that's all for now, and we'll see you next time.